Okay, so to give you guys an idea, again, of where this group of people sort of conquered, the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, essentially, now we're looking at the Assyrian, because the Babylonians were down here. Remember, they were closer to the Persian Gulf, right? Well, you can see that the Assyrians conquered a huge area, going up into modern-day Turkey. Looks like they even invaded the Egyptians, okay? And so they had access to a much greater sort of source of materials in their empire than their predecessors, the Sumerians, did. Okay. Here's some drawings that were done of some of those early excavations in Khorsabad, right? And you can see some of the winged man bulls right here. The head's missing, but it's probably over here. All right. One of the things about, well, first let's talk about this. This is one of the key buildings of this sort of culture. It's the Palace of Sargon, right? They were focused less on religious structures, even though religious structures were part of it, and more so on the ruler's, place of administration. So you can see that there is a ziggurat in this plan right here. But most of the stuff is, related to the ruler's, daily administrative affairs or other affairs, namely looking at the main court of the harem and the harem itself. So you can see also, one of the things that I want you guys to note about is this notion of symmetry and this notion of an axis and a notion of approaching and creating a ceremonious entry, as well as a separation from one side to the other. All right? And you can see right here that some of the stuff is kind of off angle. You'll see it in the next slide a little better than this. One of the things that the Assyrians were known for was they were manly men, right? Hunters, warriors. They weren't so interested in being precise and being neat and orderly. So one of the characteristics of their architecture is that it tended to be a little on the sloppy and unsophisticated side. You can see that a lot of things in this image are not lining up, that things are sort of rotated, and they kind of happened more haphazardly than might have otherwise occurred. Giving you an example in looking at this image, note that the center line of the main gate does not line up with the steps leading up to the upper courts up here. They're kind of out of plane with each other. So you would enter in through the ceremonious thing. You'd expect to walk at something, and it's like, nope, you got to go sideways, then go up. Okay? Some more drawings about the winged man bull. You see them right there. All right, and that was one of their symbols that was continually reused. Here you see another image from that early excavation, or one of the early excavations. And here is this chariot and people on horses. So they had obviously mastered horseback. And here you see the winged man bulls that were taken to the Louvre in Paris from Khorsabad. All right, side view of it. Going back to the previous one, you can get an idea of how tall these things were from the scale of these humans. So if I said, hey, how tall is this thing? You might say, well, it's about 2.5 people tall, right? So if we take this guy and bring him back in perspective, he's about that tall. So that's 2 and then a half. All right? So let's just say that these guys are 6 feet tall, even though they're French, so they're probably not. Right? They're probably shorter. Right? Isn't that one of the things the French are known for? They're a little shorter. So let's say they're 5 feet tall. Okay? Joanna, don't say anything. So how tall would that make the man bull? Let's round it to 13 feet. So those man bulls would not fit in this room, because that ceiling that you're looking at right there is 10 feet up. Okay? All right. So we already took a look at that one. So now we're going to go to the third of these sort of cultures that is part of the Mesopotamian that's part of Mesopotamia, and this is called the Babylonian New Empire. All right. So the Babylonian New Empire developed under the rule of a man named Nebuchadnezzar. Again, looking at both Jewish and Christian religious literature, you'll find that Nebuchadnezzar is one of the people that's listed in the Old Testament. That person may also be in the Quran. I'm not familiar with the Quran. You can get an idea of how sophisticated they were by this next slide, which is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Okay, and the Ishtar Gate, which we've already mentioned. So this is an artist's rendition of what, potentially the Hanging Gardens of Babylon might look like. Okay, this is a painting by, I believe it's a Renaissance artist named Peter Bruegel. So I don't know. I personally think that most things in this time period tended to be square or rectangular. But next we have a plan of ancient Babylon. Okay, and the thing about ancient Babylon is that a lot of empires have existed in the same place, right on the same banks of the Euphrates. Does anybody remember of a man named Saddam Hussein? Yes? So Saddam Hussein actually built a palace somewhere where the city of Babylon was located. Okay? But you can see that the city of Babylon was a large thing, and it was on two sides of a river, and it was a fully walled city. Okay? So here what we're looking at is a city that has walls built all around it with gateways leading into it. It had bridges across the river. The river flowed through the center of the city. Okay? On one side, you kind of get, kind of an idea of where the walls are and the thickness of the walls, and you can see the gates very clearly in that rendition. On this one over here, you get more of a clear idea of the size of maybe the ziggurats and some of the temples and things, and a more of an accurate view of it. Here is a view of that. Let me back up and go forward. So take a look at the Euphrates River and the shape of that, and then we'll come forward to it. All right? And so what you're looking at here is kind of the same region, but this one's turned sideways. And this is a piece of what was inside of Babylon. Here's one of the ziggurats. So these are all pieces that would have been inside of that overall plan size. Okay, and those things in and of themselves look fairly big, so you can imagine how big the city was. Over here is Saddam Hussein's palace, one of his palaces. And again, it was built in that same location of where Babylon was located. Going on to the next plan, here you see kind of a view of where the parts that we were looking at of Babylon are in relationship to items that are around it. Some of you may have heard of the Tower of Babel, where it was located. They've actually found that. This next slide shows a digital rendition of what the city of Babylon might have looked like and just how big it was and how big its ziggurat was. I'll back up a couple. So look at the ziggurat, okay? Look at the river, look at the sort of rectangular shape, and we'll go back to this thing. So there's the ziggurat right there, there's the river, and there's that semi-rectangular polygonal shape. Okay? But in looking at that rendition, you can see that this was a city. This is not a village. Okay? The fact that it has walls all around it and that they've flooded areas around it, right, to protect the city. That is a civilization. And then next we'll go to one of the gates, or one of the famous gates of Babylon, which is the Ishtar Gate. And here you see an old picture of it. You can see the bull, once again, one of the motifs, and other animals. Remember, they were hunters. Okay. The Ishtar Gate was one of the gates that was in that plan of Babylon. So if I back up to it, we might be able to find it. I found it before, but I'm not sure where it's at. Gate. They don't say which one's what. The Marduk Gate, Sin Gate, Ishtar Gate. There it is, right there. Okay? So going back to where we just left off, which was the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate was built of fired clay brick. Okay? And it was pigmented and colored. So this is an early rendition, and you can see once again this idea of a symmetrical axis and a symmetrical object with a different level of asymmetry to either side. Okay? Also visible here is the changing of direction by using this marker as a point to change direction. All right? This is an actual picture of the reconstructed Ishtar Gate that was taken to, I believe, to Berlin. Right? So this one's in Germany. So this one I can say, we will take it and ha to yourselves. Right? Horrible German imitation there. So I think I'm still at 11 minutes. Let me see if I can finish this off. All right. The last of the cultures that we're going to look at in Mesopotamia is the Persian culture. Now, one of the things that I want you guys to understand about the Persian culture is that it's where modern day Iran is. That's where their kind of headquarters was. All right. So Persia conquered a huge, vast area at its peak sometime around 500 before the Common Era, or BC. Okay, it had two great kings. They obviously had more than two kings, but they had two of them that sort of made their mark on history. Right, Darius and Xerxes. They built a palace. I believe it was started by one and finished by the other at a place called Persepolis. And the goal of building this palace was to glorify their power. Okay? So remember, we started with the Sumerians that were sort of humble agrarians and weavers. Then we went to the Assyrians that were less sophisticated than might have been, but they were sort of a warrior culture. And then we went to the new Babylonians, which kind of picked up on a lot of the fine things of the earlier Babylonian culture, but kept this notion of the power associated with the warrior culture. And then finally we get to Xerxes and Darius, who are trying to pick up on all of this stuff at the same time and to glorify how powerful they are. Okay? So the Persian architecture incorporated influences from across that vast region that they conquered. So they used mud bricks from Babylon, they used wood beams and logs from Lebanon. They brought in finishes from as far as India and Egypt. And they brought the Greeks in to sculpt some of their columns. Okay? So one of the things about the Persians is that the reason that we have a Western culture now is because the Greeks actually defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Okay? So the Palace of Persepolis is built on a huge stone platform. And notice that it's stone, not mud brick. Okay? So it was predominantly non-religious, which is different for a building of this scale. So typically the buildings that had a greater scale and had finer materials were religious structures. In this particular case, they were not. All right? One of the things about the architecture is that it featured this much lighter way of building, and the walls were far more open than they were in previous situations. And part of that was just the materials that they were using that allowed these greater openings. Okay? So there's this word, hypostyle, okay, that I want you guys to kind of look at, because we're going to talk about hypostyle much more when we get to the Egyptians. But hypostyle essentially means multi-column, okay? They developed a number of different sort of columns that were hybrids from a lot of different influences. They have a base, a shaft, similar to the Greek, and a capital with the palm leaf motif and the heads of bulls at the top. And I'm going to stop the video so it doesn't go over 50.